Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Gigi Barnhill, a former board member of the Historical Society, and it's great to see you here for today's History Bite. It's the first one of the season, so be here every 2 weeks into early May, right? Anyway, I think living in New England is absolutely fabulous because we have all of these quirky customs. And I've already learned something today. This quirky custom of fence viewer is mandated by the laws of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. So there's one little factoid to take home today.
Don't tell Trump.
And today we are fortunate to have one of Pelham's 2 current fence viewers. Each town not only has to have a fence viewer, it requires 2. So we're very pleased to have Joseph Larson here today. This position of fence viewer was first established in 1693. And early fence viewers armed with wall measurements were able to arbitrate and/or prosecute crimes by farmers who did not keep their fences in good form. And trespassing by livestock was illegal. I don't know what they did to the cows and the sheep. That was very bad to have your livestock get out of the field. Boundaries and fences had to be maintained. Good fences make good neighbors, as we all know. If a farmer neglected his fence, his neighbor could do the repairs and charge his non-performing neighbor twice the cost. Now, I think this is getting good. Anyway, so we're very fortunate today to have a fence viewer, Joseph Larson, who's going to explain how this ancient and honorable town position was created during the colonial era. So learn how he became involved, and he's published a handbook on fence viewers in Massachusetts, and maybe he has a copy to wave to us today, we hope.
A signed reading.
Okay. Anyway, please welcome our speaker, Joseph Larson.
Thank you. I need to explain first why I call this an ancient and honorable position. Because the actual date in Massachusetts, under the colonial statutes, fence viewers were created with 1647, for whatever. And it was created because of corn getting into cattle. And since every village and town in the state had to be self-supporting, it was important to make sure there was enough corn to get through the wintertime, feed yourself, feed your animals, and the like. And so if you go back into what are called the General Laws and Liberties of Massachusetts Bay, which are essentially the colonial statutes, you'll find that this is when the fence viewers were established. So that's the ancient part of it. The honorable part, which I've kind of added, is that if you do ancestry research and you get back to your forebears in the 1600s, 1700s, you'll find that in their descriptions or perhaps their obituary, that if they were fence viewers, that was an important thing. This was a powerful thing. And apparently only people of very high standing were appointed fence viewers. And the appointments come from the selectmen. There's no election, it's an important position. Appointed position. Their initial law gave the fence viewers the obligation to inspect common fences for defects and inefficiency. And what I mean by common fences are the fences between neighbors. If you had a fence out on the road, that's not within the purview of the fence viewer. If you look at those words, particularly the the work of Samuel Freedom in 1793, who was put together a collection of descriptions of town positions. And then look at today's modern statutes. The wording is almost exactly from colonial days. There's been enough things added, but the basic colonial statutes is reproduced but broken up in different chapters in the general laws of the Commonwealth. Today, with that colonial wording that have been expanded out to provisions like railroad fences and other modern features. There's a quote by Susan Alport, who wrote a very interesting book on sermons in stone. It's one of the classics if you're interested in stone walls. And she says she has a chapter titled, "As American as a Fence Viewer for a Town Pound." So we're down with the dogs. This is your assigned reading when I get done. How did I get into this? Well, I was walking down Arnold Road one day, and there was two of my neighbors talking, Judge Morris and George Kramer. People in Amherst know who George was. He was an attorney, and I think had a package store in town at the same time. And it turned out that George had been looking at the town report, most recent one, and he discovered there was nobody appointed as fence viewer. Now, what actually happens in a number of towns is that the job will be assigned to the police chief or somebody else, building inspector, and so you don't see it hanging out there. But ours was reported as a vacancy. So at the very next selectmen's meeting, George went up and said, "I'll volunteer to be a fence viewer." And it turned out they were about to decide to abolish the position. They weren't aware it's required by state statute. And they were very relieved to see George come back, so he became a fence viewer. Well, he made up some business cards as being fence viewer, and underneath it, in parentheses, was a semi-judicial position. Now, in fact, in some of the material that I've read on the fence viewers, that some of the authors have said the fence viewers have a semi-judicial activity. The other neighbor that he was talking to was Judge Morse. And Morse was saying, "That's not right, George." And so they were having a nice verbal battle over it. And I arrived on the scene, and it kind of interested me because I'd like to go back in the statutes and the like. And so George gave me a list of statutes that he had pulled out that governed fence viewing, and I took them home and read them. This is kind of interesting. And then I thought, I wonder if there's a handbook, because there's a handbook for selectmen, there's a handbook for town clerks, there's a handbook for the finance committee and all of that. But there wasn't any handbook. And I couldn't find any internet search. I couldn't find any in any other state. Now there may be out there, but I didn't find any. So I took George's list of statutes and went into those chapters And then I did a search on the Mass General laws under fences, stone walls, fence viewers, and came up with a bunch of others. So I said to George, hey, we can put together a handbook on this. And so we did, and we had Judge Morse look at it. His response was, I've learned more about fences than I ever wanted to. And so we decided, well, let's make it available. And so we decided to make a master copy and come down to the copy center and run off some copies. And I ran off 100. George said, oh, you need 300. There are 351 cities and towns. I said, George, let's approach this carefully. And so off we went. Now, what happened to that original booklet was that I had given a copy on a disc to the UMass Library. I said, you guys might want to have this. And so they said, snapped it up. A few months later, I got a report on email from the Berkeley Press in California, the Berkeley Electronic Press, telling me how many downloads that they had. And I thought, how the hell did this happen? I went down to the library and they said, oh yeah, they contact us, and anything that we can give them that they might be interested in, they then make it available on the internet. And that meant we didn't have to, we sold the copies at cost of the hard copies that we made for $6, and that also covered the postage. And so instead of having to go into reproducing many more of these, I give out the web address for it and the other attachments for getting into it. And the last report I got, there's somewhere over 2,000 that have been downloaded. And that's something I can report to the town report in Pelham. We're having this impact across the country. The duties of fence viewers restricted to the interior fences between neighbors, not roadside fences, and a lot of things comprise a fence under the statute. It can be a stone wall, it can be a stream, a brook, a lakeside, anything that is a barrier for animals getting into the corn or whatever. And so that gives fence viewers a lot of latitude. And what the fence viewer gets paid is $5 a day. You go into the town clerk, put in your pay slip, and he or she issues $5. Amazing. For some other reasons that I'll get around to, I'll tell you why I never collected even a single $5 bill. What's considered an adequate fence is something that's 4 feet high. No, that doesn't include the brooks and streams. Has to be in good repair. Can be made of rails, timber, boards, iron, or stone, and brooks, rivers, ponds, creeks, ditches, and hedges, etc. So all those things are possible. There are very specific procedures on how a fence viewer carries out their duties. Now, those procedures have been developed in a later law. They're not in the original, but as time has gone by, society's become pretty litigious, so they lay out the procedures. First of all, you have to have 2 fence viewers. in cases of conflict of interest. If your grandfather is having a battle with somebody in town, then you better not appear on the scene to have anything to do with adjudicating that. And so George and I started out together, and then after he passed away, then and since then I've recruited somebody else to be the fence viewer along with me. The process is a fence viewer does not go out on his or her initiative to look at fences. That apparently was what the original fence viewers did. They were commanded to inspect and make sure that there were no inadequacies between the cows and the corn. But today, there has to be a complaint filed by one or the other of the people who are contesting the adequacy of the fencing. And the fence viewer has to appear on the site, having notified both of the characters that he's going to deal with that he's on the way, and must show proof of their appointment. We don't have badges, but there are appointment letters from the selectmen, so you have to show your authenticity. The inspection has to address, first of all, is there a need for a fence? There may be a situation where somebody is just cranky and doesn't like the look of the fence. So you have to determine, is there or is not a need? And then you have to determine whether it's adequate. And there's not a real definition of adequacy. I think it probably would be driven by what are the forces going back and forth. Are they cows or chickens or just maybe your kids, your dog. But it's important to distinguish that a fence viewer does not locate the property line. You look at the fence wherever it is, and if they're saying, well, look, that thing is built 2 feet over on my land, that's not the fence viewer's job. That's the job for a surveyor. But the fence viewer can, before a surveyor comes in, can resolve the problem by saying the fence is adequate and you can't tear it down. But if you're concerned about whether it's really on or off the property line, you've got to bring in a surveyor to take care of that. So we don't have any of that responsibility. The fence viewer also assigns the cost sharing and decides which portions of the fence need to be repaired, and says one neighbor has got to do 50% and the other do 50%, or if there are different reasons, it may not be the same cost sharing. The Robert Frost quote needs a little clarification. I had the pleasure as an undergraduate of several years going to the Frost lectures in town. He'd come 1 year to the university, 1 year to Amherst College. But this is what the situation is. In his poem Mending Wall, Frost was the owner of an apple orchard, and his neighbor owned a pine forest. And they were in the process of repairing the stone wall between these, and Frost observes, why should he be doing this? His apple trees would never cross the wall to eat the pine cones. The neighbor's response was, good fences make good neighbors. Frost then comments on his view of the neighbor. I see him there, bringing a stone grasped firmly by the top in each hand, like an old stone savage, armed. He moves in a darkness, as it seems to me. So that famous quote is not Frost's. It's something he's responding to in his inevitable way. Today in Pelham, what are the fence viewers doing or have been doing since we got involved in this? We almost got a real job at one time. Down on Harkness Road, there are some neighbors. One had a garden, the other had chickens. Okay, and so you know what happened. The chickens got into the garden and scratched things up. And they weren't of a mind to settle it between themselves. So our police chief went down and looked at the situation, and he tried to get him, hey, listen, you guys ought to get together and settle this. Well, they weren't ready to do that. He says, if you don't, I'm going to bring in the fence viewers. We didn't know this was going on. Came back and said, boy, they decided to settle up. And I said, Ed, you've just taken away our first job.
It's pretty scary.
Well, there is something that we offer to do, which is really outside of the fence viewer's job, but it's somewhat related to it. We make ourselves available to people who are trying to find the markers on their boundaries, the pins, the stones, the blazed tree, and the like. And that's kind of a fun thing to do, particularly if they've got a very obscure deed. There's property up on the corner of Boyden Road and Shrewsbury Road, Buffalo Road in Pelham, which at one time was a mink farm when I was an undergraduate. And the deed reads, bounded on the north by Boyden Road, on the west by Buffalo Road, on the south by the land of so-and-so, and on the east by the land of so-and-so. Not a compass bearing, no distances, and no indication of whether the corners are marked. A friend of mine bought that land at one time, and of course what they had to do was to go around and look at all of the adjoining deeds and the town record of where the road began and ended with respect to those properties. And something like that is frequently encountered, particularly when you get into backland that has no frontage. The most important measurement on your property is how much frontage you have on the road, because that's used by the assessors to determine how you'll be taxed. But if it goes back into the woods someplace and there isn't a survey accompanying the deed, today I think you're required to have a survey, but not so long ago you didn't have to have one, or you didn't even have to have a map. But if you go back and you find one of these situations where there was a survey, no survey, there's no map, and the assessors in all of the small towns in Massachusetts faced this issue when the state decided we want to have a statewide map showing all the properties. And so they sent money out to every city and town, only enough money to create the map, no money to go out and survey. So what the assessors did in Pelham, they said, oh gosh, they had to go around searching out deeds and what town records they had, and maybe there were crudely drawn maps, and pull them all together and take the exterior of the town and start putting it together as you would a jigsaw puzzle, an incomplete jigsaw puzzle, where you could do a pretty good job along the roads. But if you got back into the woods, they ended up with big blank spaces. And they would look at the deed and say, well, it probably goes this way and it probably goes that way. And that was the map that was submitted for Pelham and for most towns of that size. So it's a common thing to run into a problem with where your boundaries are and what are the markers. If you get the markers, you can take a compass, you can take a 100-foot tape and walk out and create something for yourself, hopefully with the neighbor assisting you. So we do that, and to summarize, how would I describe the fence viewer's job today in Pelham? There is no work. There are no meetings. There are no minutes. And I get to write an annual report. which really explains what a fence viewer does and what we do that's outside the definition that we're willing to do, and that's been fun. The most recent one that I had butts right up against the Belchertown line with Pelham, and there are a couple of interesting granite posts out there, and couldn't figure out what the heck was going on. I'm going to have to go over to Belchertown now to the assessor's records and say, what do you guys have mapped on the other side? Hopefully we'll find something. But that's about it. This is my only copy of the Handbook on Fence Viewers and Laws on Fences in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. It goes well beyond just fence viewers, because there are statutes about fences. The state allows towns to declare which roads they want to have regarded as scenic roads. And if the town does that, and Pelham did that, and they voted that all the roads in Pelham were going to be scenic roads, then the planning board has to be notified if there's going to be a change in a stone wall or in the trees along the side of the road. That's what's supposed to happen. But it's obscure as far as statutes, and every once in a while someone gets hollered at for taking stone from stone walls to build something in front of their house. But that's the extent of what goes on. There's some interesting things that happen from time to time. Pleased to have had an opportunity to share them with you. No exam at the end. This is your assigned reading. I can give you the website if you want to go get it. Thank you.
Great.
Have you ever had to actually view a fence?
No. No, that's where we.
Chicken and garden.
That's
Just the one chicken.
When was the last time, do you know, someone had to officially view
I
a
have
fence?
no idea. No idea. And I'm not sure why the fence viewer position showed up in the town report. It must be showing up for years. My suspicion is that in years before we got involved, that it was something just given to the police chief or the highway superintendent to handle, but it never showed up in the town report, so I've got no idea.
I assume Pelham has former roads that have been closed, or decommissioned or deauthorized or whatever.
Yes.
Yes. Does that, I mean, do any of these obscure deeds refer to roads that no longer have a name? They may have a bit of a visible track.
Oh, yes, yes. Oftentimes they'll be included, but as a boundary.
Right.
And even though it may be an old, discontinued road, like we had one that started in northern Pelham and went across the town line, and you can still walk on it. And the deeds reference that as part of the boundary. And I think when a road is discontinued, the ownership then goes to the abutters to the center of the road. And I can't see anybody complaining about squirrels going across from one property to another.
Woodchucks, maybe.
Yes.
Since there are a lot of people here who've been involved, as I have in the society, it's worth pointing out that the Amherst Historical Society sits on a rather undefined site. All the legal descriptions and all the deeds just refer to the predecessor deeds. There is, however, a surveyed border between this library and the Amherst Historical Society. But it's the first thing that should happen.
Two roads around there, but maybe that back boundary to the parking lot is undefined. I was told by the person that does the GIS stuff for Amherst, I told him the problem that we were having, because when you file to put a building on the Mass Historical Commission's inventory of historic buildings, they want to have a map. So when our commission started a number of years ago, we have somewhere in the order of 300 houses, primarily structures, that are either on the inventory or about to finish up. Originally, we were lucky that Tom Hartman, who has the architectural firm down here, was on the commission, and he got his firm to make us maps at no cost to the town. That was great. So we were filing those. And then there was a hiatus of several years after Rob Kais, who was our archivist, passed away, where we weren't filing anything. And so I started the file again, and Mass Historical Commission came back and said, we need to have maps that show the property line. And what they gave as an example is they take the data set from Mass GIS, which is done from very accurate aerial information, and laid over the assessor's map for that particular town. And I got back to them and I said, you talk about the official assessor's map. There isn't anything that's official. And the assessors make it clear what maps they have are not to be used to assume that you own from here to there. That they're for planning purposes and assessing purposes alone. And in fact, there's a very long disclaimer that appears on when any of the state agencies use Mass GIS system. And so I got back to the commission and I said, hey, this is the situation. Well, they were not persuaded. They sent me a map that they had created, a part of Pelham, to show me what they meant. And it included our road. Well, I looked very carefully and I said, the Eisman's garage is no longer on their property. So I called him up and I said, hey, Jeff, are you sure that garage is on your property? He said, yes, it is. And the line runs right along next to the wall. So I wrote back to the Mass Commission. I said, you just made my point. And indeed, recently someone, a person who's also an attorney, feels that there was a loss of 10 feet off that property when some conservation land was acquired. And I think there's some threat for litigation. and your expert on GIS down here said that in his experience, that's one of the most problematic things, is matching up what the Conservation Commission thinks they own and what the neighbors think they own. In this case in Pelham, because there was federal U.S. Forest Service money coming in to acquire this forest, it required survey that meets federal standards. And I haven't figured out whether we're still going to see a lawsuit or not, but we're still having problems with maps these days. Yes?
The area map of Amherst contains, obviously from a single point looking down, and there's also to the sides. And as a result, the property line behind this library is somewhat doubtful, and the CVS property line is somewhat doubtful. It's a very peculiar tax map at the moment.
Well, in that kind of case, you hope there's a survey deed on both sides.
Okay.
And if there isn't, you do have a problem. You may see there, as you're driving along some of the roads in Amherst, you may see some white painted squares.
Oh, yeah.
Those are the reference points that are going to be used in the next flight over Amherst using a system called LiDAR, which is a highly accurate system that today is probably the most accurate you can get. Now, in the past, Amherst has flown Pelham at the same time up to 202 because you guys own so much of Pelham in the watershed. I hope they're going to do it again because it's a great deal of help to us to have that kind of information. Yes.
If you walk on the bike trail from, let's say, South Maple toward Amherst College, there are, of course, there are cornfields on both sides. Now there's some, there's a huge solar array on the left. But there are some underpasses there, and I was always told that that's where when the railroad was built, that was the old Boston and Maine, I think, that was for the cows to pass through, and I was wondering if they're trying to keep the cows away from the corn, if that's actually...
Well, maybe pasture on both sides.
Yeah.
There's a point on Arnold Road in Pelham where our late historian said that used to be a underpass for cows to go through. And that's when Pelham was, a great deal of it was completely cleared and farmed. You read some of the poetry written by a couple of the local poets in town, and occasionally they'll say something about Pelham, or particularly Butter Hill, which is a high point up there. And they say, well, we started off in the lower pasture, and we went to the upper pasture, and then on up. And obviously, that trail today is mature forest, if you can find the trail. Yes?
Now, does the fence viewer just view existing fences, or is there ever a conflict where a fence needs to be erected and the fence viewer is called in, or is that a different situation?
That's a good question.
Because I know of a conflict where a neighbor's dog will come over into the
Right.
and it's this little toilet bowl because they have their little spot. And so would the fence viewer be called in to perhaps settle that dispute by saying you must erect the fence?
I think the answer is probably yes. But I would see.
All kinds of
dogs and children.
situations
Well,
that could be.
If that happened with us, I would get advice from town council to make sure that we have the right interpretation of the statute. If indeed the lack of offense of any kind is a worse situation than one that's fallen down, they might say yes.
Well, so historically, it was just for existing fences, just,
Yes,
said.
yes. There were fences, and they weren't being kept up. That's the real language that's in the colonial statute. Yes?
So I have a question about the types of fences that you run into. Were there ever use of barbed wire fencing in this area, or was that a Midwestern thing?
Oh, no. There's a lot of barbed wire.
Ah,
Still there.
Still
And-
there.
See it on trees or in trees sometimes.
You know, I have a piece of property, a woodlot up on Butter Hill. And thank goodness it has a good survey, but a couple of the lines are very long from one end of the property to the other. And one thing that I have done, I've taken a metal detector and gone on, start off at a pin, take a compass bearing, and look for bits of wire sticking out of the tree. But if you don't see that, you can run the metal detector up and down the tree, and if you have 3 hits, that's the wire that's still embedded in the tree. So that
Interesting.
falls under the situation that
It's dangerous.
the evidence out on the ground is the ultimate, most important evidence of where your property is.
groundproofing.
It may be described somewhat differently in your deed, but if there's a pin out there, there's evidence of a pretty straight fence, that will be the last answer. You have to have a surveyor come in and correct something, but that's the way it is. If somebody has pulled up a pin and it's not there, you'll have a problem. Yes?
I thought you put the fence on your land, so that means that the fence itself is not on the line, it's just inside.
That's very good advice.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily done. People may, it's not uncommon to find the fence sitting on the line. And then you may have disputes over whether the thing looks good or not. And, which is also, but if you purposely move it back a couple of feet and parallel that line, then you've got full responsibility for that fence, but you make it simpler in a legal point of view, because you can say, look, that's my fence and I happen to like the way I built it, or the way I painted it, or failed to paint it because it's on my property. Yes?
So also, when it's a set of trees marking a line, in some cases you'll find a set of trees on one side of the line and a set of trees on the other side of the line.
Right.
In the 19th century, many deeds, when the land was being developed, farmland is becoming residential land. The deed may say that one or other, generally the buyer, has the duty to maintain the fence. So deeds certainly in the 19th century are pretty good on that in such situations. On the other hand, there are other deeds, for example, the farmland on either side of the road from the east to the west villages of Amherst. The southern and the road boundary is defined, although the road changed over the years. The other boundary parallel to the road is defined. The western boundary is defined, and then the eastern boundary is so much land as will make up 80 acres but that sort of thing. So the eastern boundary was ill-defined in the case of either Samuel Fowler Dickinson's property before he lost it all, 17 acres plus 29 or 30 acres. It's different. And that's extending toward the East Village. And on the other side, other Dickinsons owning, again, 80 acres.
Right.
I figure it goes to about where Salem Street is now, but
Right.
there were problems of that. But the whole fence question becomes a different question when you're going from farmland
Right,
to residential development.
and the problems.
You'll run into situations where when the road was created, they'll say, this is a 2-rod road or 3-rod road.
That's true, yeah.
But they don't give you any compass bearings or the like. So today, if you have to settle that, what they do is go out in the middle of the traveled way
Yeah.
and say this far and this far. My home property on Arnold Road, my deed goes out so far, but the town right-of-way comes in about 4 feet.
Oh, yeah.
So if I've got a tree out there that I really don't want, and it's on the town right-of-way, and I can make a case and say, if that goes over, it's going to wipe out the power lines, the town will come in eventually and take it out. But a lot of people aren't aware that, particularly if you live on a road where only a portion has actually been surveyed, and the rest has to be determined by measuring the traveled way. And who knows, that tar may have gone left and right.
And in our case, in Amherst, where some of these roads were 40 rods wide, commons, reduced to 20 rods, reduced to 6 rods, reduced to 4 or 3 rods.
Really? My gosh.
Well, they were
20 rods.
they were the commons originally. So the common in the center of Amherst now is from building to building either side, it's about 27 rods wide. But the actual road would have been somewhere in that area and probably wound up there. And that's one of the problems for the strong house stuff. The
Yes.
question of where was the road when that house was first built.
It was a wide thing.
Who knows? I guess we should have talk sometime about tree wardens. There must be some other, they work hard though now, at least.
Oh, yes,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's
They have real work
contentious,
to do.
but fun.
Yeah. Sometimes run into a lot of controversy.
Anyway, well, thank you very much.